And I remember them to talk about stuff. And when they were done, there was about probably 4, because they were quoting where doctors are, what they're headed towards. Talking about doing is cloning, and cloning bodies. And this wasn't preachers talking. This is what science says. This is what we're trying to get done. They were planning on cloning. If they could clone a whole bunch of, take your body and clone bodies for you, then you'd have replacement parts. And then if there was no head, then that's not a person. So if you want to cut a kidney out or liver out or take the heart and let the thing die, no big deal. And then the next thing they were discussing, this was literally 40 years ago, they were discussing, can we somehow get a man's body to live on grass like a cow, and that way we just got to feed him grass and be really cheap. Well, we're there. They're talking about taking people's heads off of their body and replacing them on other bodies. You say, oh, that's science fiction. You can get on the internet, and I've done it. Russia, back in probably, it's a black and white picture, and it's probably, I'm sure it'd be back at least in the 1950s, and it's like a husky dog, and on the side of the dog's head is a second dog's head. And there's a little dog's head they attached on it. Now, granted, that just was, of course, it's not attached to where it can move the body or anything, but there is 2 dogs' heads. They put a little dog's head on there, and the guy walks by, and the little dog head tries to bite him. And I think I'd bite him too. And I'm just saying, we are in some weird scenarios. That was 40 years ago. And without God is what his problem is. And everybody, I think, here knows this, but without God, nothing makes sense. You know, just like I've been listening to him a little bit, talking more about where people are asking, well, what was here before the Big Bang? Well, according to them, nothing. Nothing was here. Oh, well, I guess one guy said, well, maybe there was another Big Bang, and a Big Bang before that, and a Big Bang. And all that's doing, that's just an answer for stupid people. Because that just kicks the can down the road. Because, again, they think, well, if we just add a few more billion years, it'll make sense. And like I said, if we can get the universe just really super microscopic tiny, then you'll believe it. What was before? Nothing. So they believe in magic. There was nothing, boom, and everything's here. That takes more faith than to believe in God, is what I'm saying. Without God, nothing makes sense. Now, that's what he's dealing with here. And a couple issues even here today. Again, I love this here. It probably requires me to think more on these verses than any other book or passage. I've already been studying ahead on Ecclesiastes 8. And I'll be honest with you, I told my wife I ain't getting nothing. Look at Ecclesiastes 8. There's 17 verses. And I challenge you, you read that this week and you tell me. Man, it took me a lot of bit of thinking. Now, I think I have some really good things from that, just like here today. But Solomon's thinking deeper than we normally go. And I have to think, there's a couple verses he says here. Look at chapter 6 or 7, verse number 16. Be not righteous over much. Now, wait a second. I thought being righteous was good. Be not righteous over much. Now, we ended up, I'm going to back up before we start there. We ended kind of, and I didn't give you all the verses I want to look at, on verse 15. He says in verse 15, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. He said, and I'm on this search, and it's been worthless, vain as far as I can tell. I'm having a hard struggle with it. And he said, I've seen it all, but what really bothers me is there's a just man that perisheth in his righteousness, and there is a wicked man that prolongeth his life in his wickedness. Now, a couple of things I want to say right off the bat. I said on this one, and we started this one, sometimes the wicked do prosper. Sometimes the wicked do prosper. So we read that and say, well, the Bible must contradict itself, because the Bible teaches that God does bless you. Blessed is the man that walketh not on the count, and whatsoever he doeth, they'll prosper. That contradicts that. And then look at verse 17 at the very end, or verse 17. Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? God said if you live wicked, it's going to shorten your life. So how can that fit with verse 15? Well, something you got to realize is the book of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes are proverbs. What's a proverb? A proverb means it's generally true. A bird in the hand is worth 2 in the bush. Well, penny saved is a penny earned. But there's always exceptions to those rules. And that is exactly what he said. Look at the verse 15 again. All things have I seen what? In the days of my vanity. He said, man, when I was in another state of mind, this seemed to be true to me. And that's exactly what you read in other places in the Bible. I gave you Asaph, and Asaph said, man, as I look at things, I've washed my hands in vain. I serve God and it doesn't do me any good. And the wicked, they're bull-generate and they get ahead until I went to the sanctuary. So I'm saying, again, people will just say, well, there's a contradiction in the Bible. Not if you read exactly. He said, in the days of my vanity, it seems to me I saw a man. He didn't say this is always true. He didn't say always a just man will die early and a wicked man prolongs his life. He didn't say always the wicked live longer than the righteous. He didn't say that. He said, I've seen it though. And you know what? I told you, we've seen it too, and you see it. And it bothers us. Why do the wicked prosper? I just wrote down, sometimes the wicked do prosper. That's man's oldest question, is what we kind of ended up on. Job struggled with that. At least his friends did. They thought that there's something in humans. Here's what it is. This is why I love this book, because it is thinking about humanity and philosophies and questions you and I deal with all the time, but we're just skimming the surface. There is something in all humans. I don't care whether it's pagans, I don't care whether it's the jungles of Paraguay, my sister and nephews and brother-in-law worked all their lives. I don't care whether it's the Fiji Islands of cannibals. There's something in humans that they automatically think, if I do good, then God or the gods or whatever, it'll go good with me. And if I do bad, then bad things will happen. But we're missing something. Because that's not always seems to be the case. You're missing something. And the something we're missing is, what about sin? See, we're not including that factor. But I'm telling you, I don't care if even Christians or pagans believe there's something. And you say, well, I don't really think that. Yes, you do. Because there's times you have asked, God, why did this happen? You're asking the exact same question. You are saying, I don't deserve this. I did good. I went to church. I tried to do right as a husband. I tried to do right as a dad. I tried to do right as a church member. And if this blew up in my face, why? You're asking the exact same, you're struggling with the exact same thing. But what you're not factoring in is that little issue called sin. Because sin throws a kink in that whole philosophy. Because when we sometimes do good, bad things happen. Why? Because of sin. And sometimes people do wrong and good things happen. Why does that happen? Because God is long suffering with our sin. And we don't factor God in, or we don't factor sin in. And so it causes confusion. Again, Job's friends, I wrote down, Job's friends thought they could read Job. And since bad things, terrible things are happening to Job, they kept saying, well, you must have sin in your life. You must have some hidden, terrible sin. You had terrible things happen. And the truth is, he knew he had enough sin, spirituality. He knew he didn't. Now, again, you got to understand, Job knew he was a sinner. He talked about it. He talked about his iniquity. He knew he was a sinner. But he said, this is not happening to me because of some gross sin. He said, until I die, I will retain my integrity. What is he saying? He said, this doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why this is happening. But it's not because I have some gross sin in my life. And the fact is, he didn't. God said there's not a man on the earth like him. So why did he have all that happen? Number one, there's a God. And number two, there's sin. And Job realized, he told his wife, shall we receive good from the hand of God, not evil? And so we got to remember that. I want you to look at a couple passages on that. Look over at Luke chapter 7. Why do the righteous suffer? Why do the ungodly prosper? And why do the godly sometimes suffer? Well, it's because two things. Number one, there's sin in all of our lives. And number two, there's a God that's trying to work. And you better keep that. And in fact, he even says that. I'll have you turn to Luke, but I want you to look real quick. Look back if you can. Look back at Ecclesiastes 7, verse 18. He's kind of talking about the same thing in these verses. He's saying, it is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. He said, what I'm talking about, you better get a handle on, is what he just got done saying. He said, you better understand what these verses are saying, and you better understand this teaching. It is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. Yea, also from this withdraw not thine hand, for he that feareth God shall come forth of them all. He said, you better get a handle on this. Because that's why people drop out of church. That's why husbands and wives divorce, Christians. That's why kids quit serving God. This happened to me. He said, you better get a handle on this. He said, you better understand that you better fear God, and it does pay to serve God, but there are times it looks like God's hammering you, and it may not be even a sin. And you got to keep that in mind, even when you're going through it. You and I should not look at one another, and sometimes folks, even in our own life, and say, why? I said this, to me, it just was phenomenal. The whole book of Job, and you've heard me say this, but this really applies here now. The entire book of Job, God does not answer one question of Job on why. He never told him. You notice that? That's a big one. Because that was the whole book of Job's about. Why is this happening? God never told him. God never said, hey, Job, you see, there's this thing. You don't understand it. So you got to hang in there because there's this battle we got going on in heaven between me and Satan. And you're the focus of it. You got to hang in there to show that you love me. And people will be talking about this for thousands of years, and millions of people will be challenged by your faith. Just hang in there because this will all make sense. He didn't say one word about it. And I said it like this. All he did was he never told him why. He told him who. That's all he did. And he spends 2 chapters and he said, where were you? If you got all the answers, Job, where were you? Can you make the mountains? Can you make it rain? Can you make a cow have a calf? Can you make the sun shine? Where were you when I laid the foundation? Where were you at, buddy? With the sons of God. And all he does is just tell who he is. And Job is way more spiritual than you and I are. Because Job shut his mouth and he said, that's all I need. And we say, that's not all I need. I want to know why. He would not, did not, and will not. He will not tell Job. He didn't answer one question on why. He just told him who. And Job said, that's enough. He said, that's all I needed to know. Could you honestly say, see, again, a lot of times, and I'm going to even see that today, a lot of times we think, and I'm guilty of this, we think we're like this guy in the Bible. We're probably not even close. We're probably not. I'm not trying to discourage you. I'm just saying we all have room to grow. A lot of room to grow. And God, let's say your whole life collapses and everything you do turns to ashes. Would it be enough for you to say, I'm still going to go to church. I'm still going to pray. I'm still going to believe God. I'm going to love God. I'm still going to sing. I'm still going to have joy in my heart. I'm still going to praise God. All I need to know is who God is. Would you have that courage? Would you have that? I'm not sure I would. I'm not sure I'm that spiritual. Maybe you are. So when we look over at Luke chapter 7, just some things he said, you better get a handle on this because if you don't, it'll wipe you out. You'll quit on God. And most people in the Bible did quit on God. Most people in the Bible, there's some heroes here and there, but there was a lot of disciples that followed Jesus. There was thousands of men that followed Jesus. But there was only 12 that stuck with it. There was a lot of men that followed David, but there was only a handful of mighty men that followed him to the end, only a handful that stuck with him to the very end. Most of them spoke of stoning David, or they went with Absalom. Not very many. And he even deals with that in this chapter right here. He said, out of one man out of 1,000, I can't even find one guy that's faithful. That's what's man's biggest need to walk with God. He tells it in that chapter in Ecclesiastes 7. We'll see it. He's tying all this together, by the way. That's why it's great to see this all together. He said, I can't find one guy out of 1,000. Paul had dozens of young men that followed him. But he said, I only have one. He said, I have no man like-minded, Timothy, for all men naturally care for their own old estate. Timothy was absolutely unique. And I'd like to try to be that unique one. I don't know about you, but I would like to be the one that stays true to God. Look at Luke chapter 7. Here's why God sometimes he looks like he's overlooking wickedness. And you see that today. Again, my wife will say, this is being done, this will be done. I don't think you'll ever see Hillary in an orange jumpsuit with a number on her side. I wish you would. But I don't believe you ever will. And you say, why do people get away with that? It's not right. And I'm trying to serve. And Nancy Pelosi, again, she's worth $200 million. I told you that last week. on a salary of $120,000 a year. It would take her 200 years she saved every nickel to get $200 million. How did she get $200 million? I think it's called insider trading. We look at the corruption. Look at Clapper. They asked him the other day. He was the head of the CIA, and they asked him the other day. Now, on that Russian collusion, that was a hoax. And you and the FBI and the CIA, the whole head said that was not a hoax, and Hunter Biden's laptop was all Russian collusion, and that you've been proved wrong. Would you not sign that today? And he said, yeah, I'd sign it again. He's corrupt. And then they showed a clip of him being asked in Congress, are you surveilling the citizens of the United States? And he said, no, we are not. He's lying, and nobody cares. Nobody in America seems to care. They got the head of the FBI and the CIA, and they're both communists, ex-communists. Nobody cares. And I don't know about you, but that bothers me. Why? I'm asking. Why, God? Well, it's because God's kind. It's because God's long-suffering, and we don't like that. I want to be kind to me. I just don't want to be kind to you, I want to forgive me. I just don't forgive you, Man, I had a guy go ballistic on me the other day in a pickup truck. I wasn't reading his lips. My wife said he was saying some things, and man, he just absolutely went ballistic. And I look at it and say, what in the world? People are just going nuts. They're going absolutely nuts. Why? Look at Luke 7. Luke 7, I'm going to read verse 42, then we'll back up. Verse 42, and when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him the most? Now, what this is, I'm going to look at verse, it's good. Look at verse 36. One of the Pharisees desired him that he would eat with him, and he went to the Pharisee's house and sat down to meat. So he's sitting in a Pharisee's house. And behold, a woman in the city, which was a sinner, when she knew that Jesus sat at meat in the Pharisee's house, brought an alabaster box of ointments, stood his feet behind him, weeping, and began to wash his feet with tears, and did wipe them with the hairs of her head, and kissed his feet, and anointed them with the ointment. Now, that had to be pretty humbling. It was even back for those days also. It was humbling. And everybody knew her. She was a sinner, and whatever that means. I don't know what it was, but everybody knew she had lived a pretty wicked life. And the Pharisee's sitting there watching that. And he thinks, because he can see, he thinks that he's going to reject Jesus because he can see what's going on, and he's blind as a bat. It says in verse 39, now when the Pharisee which had bidden him saw it, he spake within himself. I like that. He didn't say it out loud. He just thinks this. This man, Jesus, if he were a prophet, would have known who and what manner of woman this is that toucheth him, for she is a sinner. And what I have written down here is he forgot he's a sinner. He's a sinner. So he looks at that woman as a wicked sinner. And if Jesus were holy, and if he were the Messiah and the prophet, he wouldn't let that woman even touch him. Well, Jesus answered, verse 40, said unto him, Simon, I have somewhat to say unto thee. And he said, Master, I love this. Say on. There was a certain creditor which had two debtors. One owed him 500 pence, and the other 50. And when they had nothing to pay, he frankly forgave them both. Tell me, here's preaching, the application. Which of them will love him most? I kind of suspicion we get to heaven and some big surprises. I think it probably some big surprises who's going to be the closest to the Lord. We say, well, Paul is, maybe, but it might be a little widow lady who decided she'd spend her life praying for Paul, and Paul might be under her. This woman here had lived a wicked life. The Pharisee hadn't. He's kind of like the two men when Jesus told another story. I'm not done with this one, but this implies too, where he said two men went to the house of God to pray. And the Pharisee said within himself, God, I thank thee that I'm not as other men are. And then he started listing all the sins. I'm not an adulterer, an idolater, an extortioner, or even like this man. He's peeking while he's praying. Or just, thank you. I'm not so like that guy over there. And the other guy was so wicked. I don't know what he had done, but God said he wouldn't even say anything. You ever been there? I've been there. He just beat on his chest and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. That's all he prayed. No fancy prayer, no bells and whistles, no trumpets, no giving, and the word he used was the word they used for the mercy seat. What he's saying is, look on me like you look on the blood on the mercy seat. That's what he's saying. And Jesus said that guy went down to the house justified, and that other guy didn't. I'm just saying, it's so easy, and you better, if we could remember this all the time, then we wouldn't be asking, well, why'd that happen? Well, what happened? Well, why did that happen? You'd never even ask that. Because of the long suffering of God, that's why. And he says, this woman will love God more. I was talking to somebody on that the other day. People say, again, I'm glad that I was raised in a Christian home, and it wasn't perfect, just like yours, and we had all kinds of problems and issues, just like every home in the Bible we're going to see in the next service. We had that, but I'm glad that my dad took us to church. We went Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday, all the revival meetings, camps, and youth conference and youth activities. We went to it all. And so somebody else comes along. I remember a guy in Illinois we had, and he got saved when he was like 40 years old. And he's kind of almost proud of, he'd say, you don't understand grace. Well, in a way, he's telling the truth, like somebody is lost. I told this to somebody, I don't think I said this from the pulpit for several years, but somebody came to Jack Hiles, and they said, Dr. Hiles, I'm trying to raise my son, but I want to ask you if you do something. He said, you'll have these men in that have, been saved out of the Hell's Angels. Jack Hiles would have, he'd have the guy on, that was in Honolulu, the first guy that saw the planes coming and saw them coming and reported it, and the Japanese guy that was in charge of bombing Pearl Harbor, he'd have both those guys come on the platform. And both of those guys got saved. And so he'd talk about mercy and justice kissing one another. No, they didn't kiss, but he's saying that only Christ can do that make them friends. So he'd have all these spectacular backgrounds. This guy bombed Pearl Harbor. And then he'd have another guy. There was another guy that was on death row. And he was to die. He was supposed to die. And I don't remember the story, but you can probably check it out on the internet. Somehow he got off. And so what he did was he searched around and he found an electric chair. And they always call him Old Sparky. I think that's pretty neat. They call him Sparky. And so he bought this Sparky electric chair, and he became an evangelist, and he'd travel all around the country, and he'd set that electric chair up, and he'd preach. And the woman would say, I'm glad that God can save me. She said, but I'm trying to raise my son to avoid all of that. And he almost thinks that it's kind of glorious to maybe be saved out of all of that background. You ever had kids say that to you? I've had church kids say that. Well, so I'm going to go out and live wicked, and then God will save me from it. He might not. So Jack Hiles preached a sermon about his life, and it was from the, they used to have from the gridiron to the gospel, Joe Boyd, professional football player, from the gridiron to the gospel. So Jack Hiles' life story was from the romper room to the pulpit. That was his story. So he preached that for that lady's sake. You don't have to live wicked to love the Lord, but it is very strange. Sometimes the people who've lived more wicked love the Lord more. That's what he just said. Look at it. Verse 42. And they had nothing to pay. He frankly forgave them both. Tell me, therefore, which of them will love him most? Simon answered and said, I suppose that he to whom he forgave most. And he said unto him, thou hast rightly judged. And he turned to the woman and said to Simon, see thou this woman? I entered thy house, thou gavest me no water for my feet, but she hath washed my feet with her tears and wiped them with the hairs of her hair. Thou gavest me no kiss, but this woman, since the time I came in, hath not ceased to kiss my feet. My head with oil thou didst not anoint, but this woman hath anointed my feet with ointment. Wherefore I say unto thee, her sins, which are many, are forgiven, for she loved much. But to whom little is forgiven, boy, the same loveth little. And he said unto her, thy sins are forgiven. And they that sat at meat with him began to say within themselves, why? They didn't like it. They didn't like it. And they said, who is this that forgiveth sin also? And he said to the woman, I don't care what they say. Thy faith has saved thee. Go in peace. I look at guys like Manasseh, the wickedest king of Israel. I mean, there wasn't one single king in the northern tribes. Israel, this is simple to remember. There were some good ones in the southern one. Israel didn't have one godly king. They were all wicked. But there was one Judah king that surpassed them all, even surpassed Ahab, and it was Manasseh. I think I'm going to preach next on the home. Next home I look at, I was thinking about this the other day. I think I'm going to preach on Hezekiah's home. He had a little bitty Manasseh, and that kid was vile. He started ruling when he was 12, and he went nuts. He was like Caligula, little boots. Just a perverse, wicked, starting from a child, just wicked. And he ruled for 55 years. And that guy you'll see in heaven someday. And I look at that and say, yeah, but he was the death knell for Israel. He's the one that God said, the blood of the innocents that Manasseh shed, which the Lord will not pardon, I'm bringing the whole thing down. You'll see him in heaven someday. And think about all the lies he ruined. All the people, he killed his own kids. He had a demon they dealt with. They took him and they drug him through the thorns. That means probably they made him a eunuch, and he's down in a prison cell. And he meets God and prays, and God forgives him. And God even allows him to get out of that prison cell and go back, and he tries to undo all the sins that he couldn't do it. He tried. He tried to reverse that. And that's another thing I'm going to look at in the next hour too. Sometimes we set sins in motion. You could be forgiven for sins. Manasseh was forgiven for sins, but he'd already set some sins in motion that he couldn't stop. And that's a scary, frightening thought. We'll see that next hour. Scary. I look at that and say, what in the world? That guy, he should go to hell. Well, the truth is we all should go to hell. See, that's what we're forgetting. We're forgetting that God's long-suffering, and we're forgetting that sin is sin. And sin throws a kink in the whole thing. And sometimes, when you look back there, you're at Luke, looking back at Matthew 6, we got to remember sometimes that God's blessings and judgment, both, are extended for a reason. God doesn't always, you do good and I'll bless you here. Now, he does say that blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel, whatsoever he do shall prosper, his leaf also. Well, there's time. There's time. And sometimes God's timing is not ours. And we'll look at somebody wicked and say, why doesn't God judge that? And why is God hammering me? Why did this happen to me? Give us some time. The long suffering, what's that mean? He suffers long. I mean, you think about God suffering for a long time because he's patient with me. That's pretty sweet. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Sometimes God's rewards and blessings, even judgment and cursing, come later. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Take heed you do not your alms before men to be seen. Otherwise you have no reward of your Father which is in heaven. Therefore, when thou doest thine alms, do not sound the trumpet before thee as a hypocrite, as do in the synagogue and the streets, for that they may have glory of men. Verily I say to you, they have their reward. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what the right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself, here it is, shall reward thee openly. But there's time. He said, when you give, don't make a big deal out of it. I have people make a big deal out of it. And sometimes, again, somebody will give a big amount of money. And like I said last Wednesday night, we've got kids that gives more to missions than some adults. We've got children here set up front here that give more to missions than some adults do. He said, don't make a big deal out of it. You know, you give one check, that kid maybe every week sets something aside. And by the end of the year, they give more than that grown man over here. He said, don't make a big deal about it, because if you make a big deal out of it, that's your reward right there. You got it. But if you don't make a big deal of it, God will reward you someday. He said he'll reward you openly. Look at verse 5. When thou prayest, thou shalt not be as the hypocrites. They love to pray standing in the synagogues, the corner of the street, that they may be seen of men. Verily I say, they have the reward. And sometimes I ask you to pray, and what I got constantly with asking you guys to do, and I know you're doing it because you don't want to be proud, but I need you to pray loud. You know, when you're praying, Bible says if we don't understand what you're saying, you're speaking a different language. Paul says, how can we say amen to what you're praying? And so, again, I'm not telling you to get up here and say, Our Father, the seventh heaven, of the 15th millennium, we praise thee today. You know, on this beautiful Sabbath morning. And you hear a guy like that, you think, you know, you're just wasting it. You're wasting God's air. Here's what he says. He said they got their reward. But when thou prayest, enter into thy closet, and when thou shut thy door, pray to thy Father. Now, it doesn't say, I had a lady in the church of Illinois said she didn't believe you should pray in public. Man, how many prayers do you see in public? How about Jesus lifting his hand in front of 5,000 people and say, God, thank you for this bread. How about Jesus on Calvary's cross saying, Father, forgive them, for they know it. He's not saying that. Don't make a doctrine out of something that's not there. He's just saying, what's your motive is what he's saying. What's your motive? And he's saying, look, if your motive is just to show, it's worthless. He says in verse number 6, pray, he said, and thy Father, verse number 6, which seeth thee in secret, shall reward thee openly. He says the same thing about fasting. Verse 18, thy Father which seeth in secret shall. And we forget that. We forget that timing. We don't like God's timing. I want to be blessed now, or I want God to judge that problem right now. But we got to remember the long suffering of God. We got to remember just accept our lot, that the reason things happen to us, God has a reason. And like I say all the time, I'll have people come and they'll have maybe a problem with the child, and sometimes I have people even come and say, I don't know, man, is this demonic? Man, that's kind of creepy to deal with that. I never make a big deal out of it. Because I would say, what happened is not the problem. It doesn't matter. What happens, what caused this isn't the problem. What are you going to do about it is the issue. You have problems in your life. What happens is not going to be the battle. The battle is going to be what are you going to do about it? Not, so this happened to me, yeah, but what are you going to do about it? That's the battle. We got to remember to not judge others by events in their lives. We got to not become bitter when others prosper. Somebody else is prosperous, and man, I wish I had that. Well, why does God bless that person like that? Well, maybe he's got a plan. Maybe he'll never tell me. Maybe he just wants me to trust him. Can't get bitter. Here's another thing. We've got to remember to not conclude that if we live righteous, we'll escape difficulty. Because even the righteous do not escape difficulty. God does teach that a man who lives for the Lord will extend his life. He doesn't say, see, here's the thing, and when I went back, if you remember about a year ago, I just searched, I wanted to check this out myself, all the verses that tell about God shortening your life and all the verses about extending your life, adding days, adding years, And to me, that was fascinating. But he didn't say, if you live right, you're going to live a long life. I'm going to be looking at David's family today, and I think of that little baby that died. That ain't right. I mean, it don't seem like it to me. Doesn't seem fair. Why did that little baby not get a chance to ever live? To grow up, to run, to play, to see, to have friends, to grow into a young man, to get married, to have a wife, to have a family, to have children. Why? God's plan for him was to die. He lives a few days and dies. That don't seem right to me. We struggle with that. He didn't say, if you live right, you're going to live a long time. What he says is, if you live right, he'll extend your life. You'll live longer than you would have. And he also teaches here, and I got to kind of hurry, kind of talking on this one for quite a while, but this is talk about struggling with the issues of life. You and I will probably struggle with this week. Something will happen. I say, what in the world? Why'd that happen? The wicked will be judged. He's not saying the wicked won't be judged. Look back at Ecclesiastes. Again, when you're studying your Bible, say, well, it looks like a contradiction there. There's absolutely no contradiction. He says in verse 15, all things have I seen in the days of my vanity. He said, when I wasn't right with God, when I was trying to find happiness and find purpose and meaning, trying to figure out life without God, it bugged me because it looked to me like once in a while I'd see a just man suffer and a wicked man live a long life. Now, he's not saying this is a hard and fast rule. He didn't say that. So he's saying that if you live for God, he'll kill you, and if you live wicked, you may get a long life. It's not what he says even in the context. Look at verse 17. Be not overmuch wicked, neither be thou foolish. God said, if you think you can live wicked and get away with it, you're a fool, is what he just said. Then he said, why shouldest thou die before thy time? That's what I just love about the Bible. Because there's times I struggle, I think, I don't understand that. There's your answer right there. He just said that God will even a wicked man. He said, if you try to live wicked, you're a fool, and God's going to shorten your life. He didn't say you'll live a long life. He said he'll prolong sometimes, he said in verse 15. And here he says, why should you die before your time? God will shorten your life, he just got done saying. Then for time's sake, I'm just going to read verse 16. Here's another one that, again, I had to really stop and think, what in the world? He says, verse 16, be not righteous over much. Neither make thyself overwise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Now, obviously, I know, again, I like this. The whole thing needs to make sense to me. So, well, there's something not right there because you're going to destroy yourself. But I thought it was good to be righteous. I thought it was right. Being righteous means doing the right thing, being right. And he's saying, don't do that on a lot of stuff. In your life, just make sure you're not righteous over a whole lot of stuff. Just maybe kind of 50-50. Is that what he's saying? No, he's not saying that. You know that. To me, you can even pick it up in the English. You kind of know that can't be it, because he says, look at it. To me, the phrase that kind of shows, no, that's not exactly what he's saying, is that next phrase, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself overwise. He's not just talking about doing the right thing. He's talking about you making yourself righteous. And then I remember that Jesus and Paul both talked about there's different types of righteousness. There's God's righteousness and there's self-righteousness. Paul said about the Israelites, he said, they've gone about to establish their own righteousness and have not submitted themselves to the righteousness of God. There's God's righteousness, and then there's man's righteousness. And there's a difference. Even hopefully you're paying attention even on our Sunday night studies when I talk about the bride, and the bride is given a white gown, which is the righteousness of the saints. And people say there's a mistake in the King James because you don't have the righteousness. It's Jesus' righteousness. Not in that passage. He's not talking about salvation. He's talking about what you do right in service for the Lord. That's what your gown's going to be consisted of, if you believe the Bible. Because he just said the righteousness, the white garment is the righteousness of the saints. There's different types of righteousness. So why would he say here, be not righteous over much, neither make thyself overwise, for why shouldest thou destroy thyself? So you know, well, he's probably not talking about good righteousness here, because he said if you have a lot of this, it's going to destroy you. And I wrote down, here's my phrase for this one. You've heard this one. I like it. Some Christians are so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly use. I think that's funny. Some Christians are so heavenly minded, they're of no earthly use. And I'm not going to get into this one, but it is a deep one. And I'll just tell you what it is. For 2,000 years, I'll just tell you the beginning of it. And again, say, well, this isn't that important. You deal with it all the time. More than you know. There's two philosophies that have dogged Christianity, and I'll show them to you next week, or the following week, probably because of VBS. And they struggle with it then, and we still struggle today. And one's called asceticism, and the other one's antinomianism. And they're two extremes, and their children are with us to this day. And one teaches, in a nutshell, that the way you please God or get some even, there's different levels of both. And asceticism basically is acknowledging that we're sinners and our flesh is so bad that you have to shut the flesh down, maybe even just punish the flesh. That's where you got monasteries and self-flagellation and wearing woolen clothes and eating, just vegetables and vows of poverty. And asceticism is, I'm bad. Man's so bad, and we got to say no to all manner of the flesh. And there's all sorts of rituals that come along with that. And the other extreme is called antinomianism. And what that is saying is that, well, we are sinners, but God is so good that you can just sin and get away with it. So it is even led where there's some guys, even in history past, that teach the way you're saved is through sin. And the more you sin, the quicker the Messiah will come. I'll show you those things. But there's all these little babies that are born from that. Pentecostals, I was thinking that this morning. Pentecostals they kind of flipped. When I started the ministry, Pentecostals were the ones, they didn't have the rock and roll in their church services. And the women would wear their hair up maybe in a bun, and they'd wear the dresses to the ankles and no fancy clothes. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but they were doing it for salvation. They believed that's the holiness group. And they stayed away from the world, and they stayed away carnality. They stayed away from it. Over here, asceticism. But you know what now? Today, Pentecostals teach, hey, it don't matter. You sin and do whatever you want. God's grace is sufficient. And where it even leads, where there's people even in our area that have been taught that as a Christian, you can do whatever you want, and there's no judgment. There is no such thing as sin, which is nuts. So how do they get that? They start looking at life's issues, and they don't think it through. But the Bible does think it through for you. And God teaches those are both heresies. But what I want you to see is all of those minor things. Like saying, well, God's good. And so, it doesn't really matter. You don't have to go to church if you're saved. And if you mess up, I was talking to a guy, a farmer over at Cortez. And he'd helped me out quite a bit. This is about 4 years ago. And he's not on the earth anymore. And he's a good man. And I said to him, man, I really appreciate your help. I said, you've really been a help to me. And he said, well, Brother Reitz, he said, you and your family have been such a help to my family. And so I don't really know how that could be. And I said, well, sometimes I feel almost guilty because you helped me so much. He said, but aren't we perfected forever from sin? What he's rebuking me for feeling like I maybe should not feel any remorse for maybe taking advantage of him, like I felt like I was. And I know what the guy believes. He believes there's no such thing as sin. I'm just telling you, these issues that are in the Word of God, you and I struggle with them more. What we need to do is take these verses, and I'll say one last time, verse 18, it is good that thou shouldest take hold of this. He said, you better hang on to some of these truths, because if you don't, you'll be a castaway. You'll be a castaway. I told you I got a list of 300-400 people in the 30 years we've been here. 300-400 people who are in this church that no longer, most of them don't even go to church anywhere. I told that to one guy, and he basically says, because of your preaching. Well, if that's the case, then Jesus was an absolute failure. What happened was Jesus started out with thousands. He had 120. He had 70. He had 12. He had 3. He had 1 come back to the foot of the cross. The closer you get to the Lord, the less people want to follow the Bible and obey the Word of God. And these are the issues we struggle with that knock us out. And we need to get a handle on. Let's bow our heads for a word of prayer. Father, help us in our lives to get a handle on these. Take hold. You said that just now. It is good that you take hold of these things. We better get a handle on some of this. And I understand this might even be boring to some here today. They might say, well, I don't really. And that's the immature Christian that's going to get wiped out. Because Solomon's not playing footsie here. He's not dinking around on issues that aren't important. He's saying, look, this will cost you your life if you don't get a handle on this. You'll be a castaway. You'll be somebody set on the side. You'll be a broken vessel set on the side. You'll quit on God. If you don't understand some of these issues we're looking at right here, God, help me to get a handle on them. But then more than that, help me to hide in my heart and then bring these verses and these thoughts back to my remembrance when I'm really need them, when I'm going through the battle. Well, thank you and praise you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.